there are some flags that are meaning much more at the moment than just a flag in support of a particular football team, but they're also having a political weight. If they were dealing with another country, I would probably tell you it's very likely that FIFA are just gonna do what they usually do. But in this case, because they are dealing with the United States, and also because of how contentious the Palestinian flag and to a lesser extent the Mexican flag have become, we're gonna have to see what happens.
This is America's Cup, how the world's favorite sporting event will meet America's own vision for it. The right to protest and freedom of expression that's really taken a hit in the last few weeks in the United States. I think we're going to be looking at protests quite a bit in the lead up to the World Cup. But today I really wanted to have a discussion about flags and flag waving more generally. If there's one thing at a World Cup that you're going to see, it's going to be flags. Your country's flag or your team's flag. One of the funny things about football matches and World Cup matches is you go to a game, you're not only going to see the flags of the countries that are playing, you're going to see all kinds of flags from different countries, from local teams. I mean, you could go to a Brazil match at the World Cup and still see a Luton Town FC flag draped from the stands. Flags are such a symbol of pride. I think one really hopeful story is from a World Cup that I remember really well, the 2006 World Cup in Germany, when the German national team was really having a renaissance. They were really looking good. And for the first time in 60 years, Germans started patriotically flying their flag again. It was just such a thing that you wouldn't do post World War II. There was a sense of not showing your national pride because of your history. I'm going to butcher this, but the Germans started calling that Sommermärchen, or summer fairy tale, just for this kind of reignition of patriotism. What will it mean to fly a US flag? By waving a US flag in 2026, does that mean you're inherently on board with what the current administration is doing? Or is it a statement of, I'm proud of my country despite what's going on? Is it a symbol of resistance? Or is it just, hey, I'm on board with Team USA? The summer in June, after a series of ICE raids in Los Angeles, there were a series of protests where protesters wore and carried the Mexican flag. And that was obviously misconstrued by the right wing as a symbol of being anti-American. But of course, it was a way of connecting with people's Mexican heritage or showing support for the people being oppressed. And then, of course, at this current time, we can't have this conversation about flags without talking about the Palestinian flag. That's a flag we've seen raised in football matches across the world. The Palestine football team came closer than ever, really, for qualifying, but they didn't make it ultimately for 2026. However, FIFA rules state generally that you're allowed to bring any flag of your choice to a stadium, any national flag, regardless of qualification. But what will the scrutiny be like at venues? Are they going to see the Palestinian flag, for example, as overtly political? So I wanted to have a couple of conversations today. One is around the realities and the logistics of flags and protests. If we're coming to this World Cup, what are we going to expect when we get to the stadiums or the areas around the stadiums or the fan fests? And to help me get into that conversation, I spoke to Emerson Sykes, who is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU, that's the American Civil Liberties Union. He basically focuses on First Amendment free speech protections, which have taken quite a hit. My second guest is a professor at the London School of Economics, César Jiménez Martínez. And with him, I jumped into more of a philosophical discussion about, well, why does it matter? What are flags? What do they mean? Why does a cloth or a banner mean so much as an expression of pride or protest? Why do we care? Before we jump into those, I think it's worth looking at some of the regulations. FIFA does allow anybody to wave any flag of their choice, as long as it conforms to, some things like that. They have to be non-flammable, handheld with short poles, that kind of thing. What's not allowed is any kind of flags or banners with text or political speech that might be construed as offensive or discriminatory. Quote unquote, flags must not provoke or disrupt. Of course, this is all going to come down to each venue's scrutiny, though. If you're in line at the MetLife Stadium and the person at the gate or at the metal detector is having a hard time with your Palestinian flag, there's really not much you can do about it at that moment if you want to get into the game. It's really just at their discretion. It happened in Qatar in 2022 when, anecdotally, some Qatari security personnel would confiscate pride flags. Now, pride flags are one type of non-national flag that FIFA does allow because they're seen as inclusive, not really political. There were stories about those being confiscated. Again, FIFA has the authority, but there are going to be layers of hierarchy. What about local authorities, municipalities? Are they going to restrict the freedom to gather and protest outside the stadium or in fan zones? Then again, they might be more lenient than I think. I look back at some images from 2022 in Qatar, and Iran played England in their opening match. And some of the Iranians that were attending were protesting the killing of Mahsa Amini, who was a young woman who died in the hands of the morality police in Iran. These fans obviously wanted to use the world stage to get their message out. So there were a lot of banners in the crowd with Iranian flags that did have political messaging, saying things like freedom for Iran, and some football jerseys with Mahsa Amini's name on them. So here's my interview with Emerson Sykes from the ACLU. Emerson and I happened to be speaking just a couple of days after Jimmy Kimmel had been thrown off air, obviously now reinstated, but really must have been quite a busy time for him and raised quite a few more questions about how free freedom of speech really is.
My name is Emerson Sykes. I'm a senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union. I am a member of the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where I focus on First Amendment protections. That includes freedom of speech, the right to protest, and a variety of different contexts.
So, yeah, Emerson, obviously I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these things that you mentioned, the freedom to protest, flag waving, things like that we might encounter at the World Cup, things that are normal at a World Cup, right? Is that usually up to FIFA to decide, or will it be up to the government? And if so, federal, local, state?
Yeah, so this is the good question. So the reason that these things generally don't come across our desk is the First Amendment within the U.S. constitutional framework only applies when there's government censorship of private speech. So obviously we care a lot about other types of censorship, private censorship of other private speakers, whether that's on social media or other places, but that's not a constitutional issue. So a private entity like a sports league, like a sports franchise, has its own First Amendment right to curate speech and make rules that they see fit, right? If the NFL decides you're not allowed to say something, that might not be good for free speech, but it's not a First Amendment violation because the NFL is not the government. Similar with other leagues and private franchises, sports teams and clubs. So FIFA is not a government, it's not the US government, and so it can set its own rules for what happens at its events, and similarly venues might have their own rules. So there'll be an overlap of the venues rules and then FIFA's rules. What we would be worried about from a constitutional perspective would be the extent to which local or federal officials or law enforcement crack down on folks based on their speech or activities at games. And so FIFA would have a lot more leeway to say they could ban all flags. They could ban flags that are not for countries that are participating. Or they could do all sorts of things that a government couldn't ban. But we do anticipate that in the World Cup setting, we'll be looking both at the enforcement by stadium officials and by FIFA, but also more specifically for our work, law enforcement.
So that sounds like things could get murky in terms of if there's so much overlap between different authorities, and also, does FIFA have oversight over a stadium and then the entrance to the stadium and then the borders of a stadium and then the fan fest, right? There's so many different points to think about.
It's true. There definitely are gray areas. I mean, I think generally there are sort of ticketed areas where private security will be in charge of making sure that folks have the proper authorization and those sorts of things. But to the extent we see protests around political issues, sort of non-sports related speech, I would say, I would not be surprised to see if local law enforcement are involved in responding to some of those issues that may be around the periphery and outside of the stadiums. Though they could also, be called into the stadiums as well.
I know a lot of this is speculation, but do you foresee there being crackdowns on protests, like, for example, anti-Israeli acts in Gaza, which a lot of, not just Americans, but a lot of kind of European fans are likely to engage in?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to anticipate what the news cycle will be in 9 months. The last 9 months have felt like several years. So I hesitate to predict what might be the subject of protests next summer, but I do think it's quite a safe bet that there will be some protesting on some issues of global or local importance.
But could you see kind of a hardline crackdown? I suppose we already saw the government revoking student visas for speaking out for Palestine or for Palestinian rights. Could they do things like revoke tourist visas for doing things like that?
What they can do and what they might try to do, this administration has shown itself to have at least authoritarian tendencies. I think might be clearer to say authoritarian actions. And so it is obvious that the Trump administration is keen on having the World Cup be a success in its own eyes. And so it's not something that is off the radar. We know that Trump is paying attention to the World Cup. We can anticipate that he does not want to see protests, especially protests against him, especially protests against other positions that he supports. He has shown himself to be totally intolerant of dissent and of protest. As you said, it's speculation, and I don't want to, speak these things into existence, but I do think it's worth anticipating the likelihood that there will be some sort of political actions during the World Cup, and that at least some of it will frustrate and anger this administration.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up this point that they want the World Cup to do well, right, in the eyes of the world. So it's sort of, do they want to paper over the cracks and show that everything's fine, or do they want to use it as a way to crack down and show the world that they don't tolerate the things that they don't want to tolerate?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. On the one hand, this administration does not want to see a clash in the streets outside of the World Cup being broadcast around the world. At the same time, they don't want protests being broadcast either. So how they choose to respond, I think we will have to see. But we and many, many other organizations and activists will be watching closely.
There are certain countries that have travel bans against them, but that have qualified for the World Cup. Specifically, Iran is a big example. We don't know yet whether that ban will be reversed for family members or fans or whatever. Do you think something as simple as flying an Iranian flag will be okay, or will that be seen as anti-American?
I think it's unlikely you'll see a ban on flying flags for countries that are participating, but I do think there will be a heavy incentive on behalf of organizers and others to limit what types of displays are depicted on flags, and how those rules are articulated and enforced, I think, will be something really fascinating to watch.
We're speaking at an interesting time with yesterday Jimmy Kimmel being pulled off the air and new questions about freedom of speech. If we'd have done this interview a couple of days ago, would you have different answers? Has yesterday really thrown even more of a curveball in the context of what you do?
I mean, yes, the last 2 weeks have been different. I will say that. I mean, there's always a lot going on regarding the First Amendment, but if you ask any of my colleagues, the last 2 weeks have been especially busy. You're right that things do feel different in the last few days, but I don't know that my answers would be any different in terms of the rights of protesters, the likelihood of protests, and the types of responses that we can anticipate. If anything, what we're seeing is that the administration is trying to control information flows, discourage protests, such that by next summer, they're hoping, I think, that they don't have much to deal with.
Well, Emerson, I think I asked everything I wanted to. Who are you supporting in the World Cup?
Of course, the U.S. And then I spent some time in France. I support France. There's a lot of Arsenal players on the England team, support England, all the African teams. But the ACLU always says dissent is patriotic. So that's usually my version of patriotism, is to dissent. But when it comes to world soccer, it's full patriotism. USA all the way.
Okay, yeah, love that. I mean, they're always such a fun underdog to root for, but I don't know if they'll be the villains this year.
The rare instance where the USA is the underdog, the lovable underdog.
Right. Great insight there from Emerson Sykes. Let's zoom out a little bit because I want to now get a sense of, well, what are flags and what do they mean? What do they mean to a nation's identity in good times or bad? This is the more philosophical segment of the episode for people who want to think about it a little bit more deeply. So here's my interview with César Jiménez Martínez, who's an assistant professor at the London School of Economics. A lot of his research has been in the personal and collective identities that nations have, how countries build their identities and promote them, and how those are seen in the media. Well, Cesar, yeah, I really appreciate you joining. Are you Chilean originally? Is that right?
Yes, I am
Yeah.
originally from Chile, but I've been living in London for now 15 years. So I consider myself a Chilean Londoner. It's a mixture of both.
Yeah, love that. Do you mind just telling me a little bit about what your work concentrates on?
Definitely. So basically, the overall topic of my research is about how the media relates, engage, and contributes to construct and communicate the idea of the nation. So basically, I'm fascinated by the idea of the nation and national identity because if we look at it historically, it's a relatively new idea. So a few centuries ago, people might identify themselves with their families or kins, with cities, with religions, and so on, and not with national identity. But I find very interesting, for instance, an exercise that when I teach about media and the nation, I ask my students, where are you from? And they start telling me, I'm from Chile, Argentina, the UK, the United States, etc. And then I tell them, did you realize that I didn't ask you from which nation state are you from? I just asked you, where are you from? You could have told me a city, you could have told me planet Earth, all those would have been valid answers. But we have so ingrained the idea that the nation is the natural way of living and structuring the world. Basically, I look at from different perspectives the role of the media on that. And from that, I have examined, for instance, the relationship of the media with nation branding, which is one way of communicating the nation. But also, I have looked at that from the perspective of protests, which is also very much like the whole idea that the state has a monopoly on violence, which is at the core of the nation state. Well, who defines what protests are considered valid and which kind of protests are violent and therefore are not valid as forms of democratic expression?
That's so interesting. So I probably should have asked you, where are you from, instead of are you from Chile? I asked a leading question there. So just to ask the broad question, why are flags so important to a nation's sense of identity or brand?
So I would say that the first thing is that we need to acknowledge that nations are essentially abstract. So we don't see in the air the UK or Chile or the United States or any other nation. And because they are abstract, they need symbols and they need performances. So they become concrete. And flags are one of those symbols, perhaps the most important symbol nowadays to communicate national identity. It's interesting when you examine the history of flags, so there is no clarity on what was the first flag ever, but some of the uses that they were given in the past was for military uses. But over time, when the modern nation states started to emerge, gradually they started to be adopted as something that all nations should have. So what's very interesting is that flags are not seen like the exception. It's not that, oh, one nation state has a flag and another one doesn't have it. But we could say that there's a kind of like global grammar of nationhood. And that is one of the things that is expected of a nation state. So you should have the national anthem, you should have the flag, and you should have other symbols that make it concrete. And because of that, even though technically it's just a piece of cloth with some colors and some symbols, they have become to mean so much for people all over the world.
Yeah. And how much do they play a part, or how vital are they in the context of protests as a protest symbol?
That's something that I found very interesting because, for instance, if you look at protests like around 20 something years ago, like for instance the ones that happened in 1990 in Seattle, at that time, protests used to be very much focused on globalization, and their targets were global institutions. So they were very much like protests against the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on and so on. Those protests continue, by the way. But what I found very interesting is that in the last 10-15 years or so, protests have also become markedly national. It's not that in the past they were not. And if you look at throughout the century, you're going to find plenty of examples of national protests. But they have become more explicitly so. And it's interesting to see how people go to the streets. Quite often they claim to act on behalf of the country. So I found very interesting when, for instance, you look at some of the protests that happened in the United States around June or July, how people were saying this is not America when they were criticizing the government. Therefore, the implication was like, we, the people on the streets, are the real America. And they were talking on behalf of the United States. And that is just one example. So you can think of cases of protests that happened in Serbia also earlier this year, that people were carrying the national flags, and also in Chile, in Brazil. So it's basically the nation gives them like a framework of solidarity. So we're all on this together. But also targeting the state is much easier and concrete rather than targeting the International Monetary Fund or targeting the World Bank. So it's something that you can see that can be transformed. So it's a mixture of symbolic things, of solidarity, but there is also a pragmatic issue. And that's why they have become so relevant in protests all over the world.
Yeah, one recent example that I keep thinking about is the use of the Mexican flag as a symbol during the LA protests against ICE in the summer. These are Hispanic folks who are proudly American. Part of what they're trying to say is we are American, but the Mexican flag is also a symbol of their heritage, right?
Absolutely. So what happens usually with migrants is that they have this double or sometimes triple identity. So I'm proudly a citizen of this country, but I also have this history, this heritage, and I'm also have. So it's not that I'm either American or Mexican, but I'm both. And it's interesting how, as you were pointing out, that flag that in other circumstances would have been like a notice became so contentious also.
I'm trying to figure out what the rulings are going to be during this World Cup, because from my knowledge, FIFA usually allows any country's flags, regardless if they've qualified or not, as long as they don't have political slogans or anything like that on it. So in Qatar, we saw, for example, a lot of people waving the Palestinian flag because it was an Arab World Cup. And obviously this time, I expect there to be a lot of Palestinian flags if they're allowed. I mean, do you think that's fair to be able to fly whatever flag in a stadium that you want?
I think that it's going to be very interesting to see what FIFA and the authorities allow in the next World Cup, because traditionally FIFA and not only FIFA, the International Olympic Committee is quite similar. They have a tradition of like overruling local legislation for a time and different ways. So I remember when, for instance, during the World Cup in 2014, Brazilian law did not allow to sell beer, but they had to change the law so that could happen. And there were similar discussions about Qatar and so on. And FIFA has been quite successful in doing that. However, now it needs to do it in the United States, which is the most powerful nation state in the world. And we need to see. So I imagine that there might be some negotiations on that. And basically there might be some controversies because, as you're saying, there are some flags that are meaning much more at the moment than just a flag in support of a particular football team, but they're also having a political weight. And traditionally, organizations like FIFA are saying, we're all about sports, we have nothing to do with politics. In practice, sports is always entangled with politics, but that is the discourse of these organizations. If they were dealing with another country, I would probably tell you it's very likely that FIFA are just gonna do what they usually do. But in this case, because they are dealing with the United States, and also because of how contentious the Palestinian flag and to a lesser extent the Mexican flag have become, we're going to have to see what happens in the year or a little bit less that we have in preparation before the World Cup.
Obviously, the World Cup seems like such a perfect venue, just being the world stage, to be able to, as a private citizen, make your feelings known. And I keep going back and forth between, is the Trump government going to want to let that happen to show that, oh, everything's fine, freedom of speech is allowed, or are they going to want to crack down to show that we mean business?
That's a very good question. And I think that's also probably going to be part of the journalistic narrative to that. Something that is interesting that has been happening gradually in the last few decades is how the attention, and rightly so, by the way, of the media has not only been on the event itself, but also the preparation of the event. And that has taken different focuses on different places. So in some cases, like in Qatar, it's been, well, are things going to be ready on time? And how is this World Cup going to be played with all the temperatures in this case? Okay, in the case of Brazil, are we going to have a stadium sometime or not? So I think inevitably that's going to be part of the discussions, and we don't know what's going to occur because potentially it could go on both sides. It could be that there is like some kind of truce and nothing happens, which is what has occurred in other places, or that maybe the government is going to crack down on security. And that's one of the big question marks that the next World Cup will have.
As someone who researches identities and brands, what are your thoughts on how the US is building and promoting its brand in the media at this particular moment?
The US has always been a very interesting case because it's also an outlier. It has tons of material and symbolic resources that no other country has nowadays. And therefore, perceptions of the United States are a mixture of what authorities do, but also a lot of what other non-state actors are doing. Okay, and I'm talking Hollywood is a typical example. There are a lot of things that have nothing to do with governments and also construct the image of the United States in different places. We can also think of corporations like Coca-Cola that have also become a symbol of America around the world for good and for bad in different places. So I think that it's a very complex place, but also with that national images are relational. So you also need to pay attention to who you are asking. So there are many people around the world that are very concerned about what's going on in the United States, but equally, there are also some people that are very happy with it. And there are many people that you can look at. There are some Latin American presidents that are going to tell you that the United States now is the example to follow. I wouldn't talk about the image of the United States as an object that is the same everywhere, but much more like a relationship that it depends not only on what the United States is doing or different people and institutions in the United States are doing, but also who is on the receiving end.
I know you've also written about Brazil's 2013 protests before the 2014 World Cup. And I know those were very different protests, but are there any parallels between that moment and the moment that we have coming up?
I don't really see that many. I think that one of the elements that happened in Brazil was the sense of surprise. So basically, for any casual observer, Brazil was doing well. And there was a very famous cover by The Economist that says, like, Brazil takes off, a cover from 2009. Of course, keen observers could notice that things were not perfect. But if you talk to any person who would just like have a very general view of things, their feeling was like, why are Brazilians doing this? Number one, because the country's doing well. But also, it had the other component that the stereotype of Brazil is like the country of football. And therefore, the protests, even though they were very complex, the general perception was very much like, how could it be that the country of football is going against football?
Yeah.
Okay? In the case of the United States, we have a country that is seen, especially from the perspective of Latin America, Europe, and other places, like this place that has not embraced football or soccer, as they call it. But I would say that what's going on is a sense of concern and potential unease of how the authorities are going to react with people traveling to the country. So there is very much of like, this is a country that the current discourse of the authorities is very much like, we want to take care of our borders, there are certain people that we are not welcome here anymore, and so on. So in that context, well, what's going to happen with all the football fans that are going to travel there? To what extent those fears are going to become truth or not, we don't know yet, but that's something to pay attention to.
I suppose just to end on a more hopeful note, I suppose flags at the World Cup can also be a sense of optimism and pride. I'm thinking about 2006 when Germany hosted, and it was the first time that Germans were proud to fly their flag again for the first time really in half a century even. Does the World Cup, despite all the corruption, does it feel like an optimistic time?
Oh, absolutely. There is this famous video by John Oliver a few years ago in which he was making jokes also about all the corruption and so on the World Cup. But there is something that as soon as it starts, many people start watching it. Of course, one can make the critical argument saying, but that basically means that they are concealing or they're distracting people, etc., etc. But it's also the more optimistic reading that is, well, it's basically a month of party, of engagement, and of giving you hope to some extent. Even if your country, like Chile, has not qualified to the World Cup, still on the next day you go to the office and you talk, oh, did you see the match of this one or this one? Did you see the new football star that is appearing? Did you see the goal? And that is something that I think should also be celebrated. Yes, there are a lot of things to complain about it. Yes, and we need to, rightly so, carry on paying attention to what authorities and FIFA do and how they can exploit this. But let's also not forget that this can also be a happy moment. And all over the world, it's not only a summer party, but also I grew up in the Southern Hemisphere, and the World Cup was a way of also illuminating our winters.
What happened to Chile, man? I used to enjoy watching them in the tournament.
I know. Basically, we had an amazing generation, we call it the golden generation. But unfortunately, there was no like a renewal of that.
I can relate as an England fan about suffering. That's about it for today. Thanks so much for joining again. My newsletter, talibvisram.substack.com/subscribe. Please do subscribe and leave a rating or review of this podcast. You can do that on Substack, or you can do it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.